During a family feast, my son-in-law threw a defiant line. "Your throne is a toilet, old king. Sit down and get out of the way." The guests laughed, delighted with his humor, but I, the old king, just smiled, got up, and made one call. After 30 minutes, he received a call at the door and begged me to stop it, but I couldn't. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments. The chair scraped against hardwood as I pushed back from the table, wine glass catching afternoon light streaming through lace curtains. Turkey bones lay scattered across the white tablecloth like battlefield remnants, gravy congealing in ceramic boats between half-empty wine bottles. Friends, I want to tell you an old joke about a king who... "Your throne is a toilet, old king. Sit down and don't interfere." Alex's voice cut through my words like a blade through silk. The dining room erupted. Mary Ann doubled over, clutching her pearls, gasping between bursts of laughter. Jim slapped the table so hard his water glass jumped. Susan wiped tears from her eyes, while Paul applauded like he'd witnessed Broadway magic. "Oh my goodness, Alex, you're a genius!" Mary Ann wheezed, her face crimson with delight. "That's the funniest thing I've heard all year," Jim roared, raising his wine glass in mock salute. "Brilliant, absolutely brilliant," Susan echoed, still giggling uncontrollably. My mouth hung open mid-sentence. The words I'd been about to speak dissolved like sugar in rain. Alex leaned back in his chair, face flushed red from wine and triumph, soaking up their praise like sunlight. His eyes sparkled with malicious satisfaction as he watched me stand there, frozen. Emma shifted uncomfortably beside him, shooting worried glances between us. Her fork trembled slightly in her hand, but she said nothing. Always the peacekeeper, my daughter, always hoping family storms would pass without intervention. I remained standing for 3 long seconds that felt like hours. The laughter continued, rolling over me in waves. Alex poured himself more wine, his movements exaggerated and confident. He'd found his audience, and they loved him for it. "Don't look so serious, Frank," Jim called out, still chuckling. "It's Thanksgiving, time for jokes." "Alex has such a quick wit," Mary Ann added, dabbing her eyes with a napkin. "You raised quite the comedian, Emma." My daughter's smile looked painted on. She knew. She could sense the shift in the room's temperature, even if the others couldn't. 20 years of peaceful retirement, 20 years of being just another grandfather at family dinners, had made them forget who I used to be. But I remembered. I lowered myself back into my chair, slowly, deliberately. My face arranged itself into what might have looked like a smile to the casual observer. Inside, something cold and calculating stirred to life after decades of slumber. "Very clever, Alex," I said quietly, my voice steady as winter ice. He raised his glass toward me in mock salute, still basking in the afterglow of humiliation he'd delivered. The others gradually returned to their conversations, passing dishes and refilling glasses, the moment already becoming dinner party legend in their minds. I reached for my wine, fingers steady despite the fire building in my chest. Alex had just made the biggest mistake of his life, and he didn't even know it yet. The applause hadn't fully died when Susan leaned across the table, eyes bright with admiration. "Alex, you're absolutely on fire today. Where do you come up with these lines?" Alex straightened in his chair, chest puffing with pride. His face had grown redder, whether from wine or validation, I couldn't tell. "Just comes naturally, I guess. Some people have it, some don't." He shot me a sideways glance, smirking like a schoolyard bully who just pushed the class nerd into mud. The gesture wasn't lost on the others, who chuckled appreciatively at his implied superiority. "Frank, don't take offense," Jim waved his fork dismissively. "It's just humor. You know how Alex is, always keeping us entertained." "Exactly right," Mary Ann nodded enthusiastically. "Remember last Christmas when he did that impression of the mailman? I nearly choked on my eggnog." They were building him up, feeding his ego like kindling to flame. Each compliment made him sit taller, smile wider, pour his wine more carelessly. Red drops splashed onto the white tablecloth as he filled his glass to the brim. Emma placed her hand on his arm gently. "Alex, that's enough." Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "Relax, people." Alex brushed her off with theatrical wave. "It's just humor. Everyone's having fun, aren't we?" He looked around the table, gathering nods and smiles like a politician collecting votes. I sat perfectly still, cutting my turkey into precise, even pieces. Each slice fell away cleanly, methodically. My movements were calm, controlled, giving nothing away. But behind my eyes, wheels were turning, plans forming like storm clouds on the clear horizons. Paul leaned back in his chair, patting his stomach contentedly. This is what I love about family gatherings. Good food, good laughs, good company. He gestured toward Alex. An entertainment that beats anything on television. Here, here! Jim raised his glass again. To Alex, our resident comedian. To Alex! The others chorused, glasses clinking together in celebration. My son-in-law basked in their attention like a lizard on hot stone. He'd found his moment of glory, his chance to be the star instead of the struggling gambler with debts he couldn't pay. For these few minutes, he was king of the table, and I was just the old man he'd dethroned with clever words. Emma's discomfort grew more visible with each passing toast. She pushed food around her plate without eating, glancing between her husband and me with increasing anxiety. She knew her father well enough to recognize the stillness that had settled over me. It wasn't defeat. It was calculation. You should do stand-up comedy, Susan suggested, refilling her own glass with shaking hands from continued laughter. Maybe I will, Alex replied, his voice growing louder and more confident. I've certainly got the material. Another pointed look in my direction. The conversation flowed around me like water around stone. I listened, observed, filed away every word and gesture. Alex was digging himself deeper with each boast, each cruel aside. He thought he'd won something here today. He had no idea what he'd actually done. I set my napkin beside my plate and stood slowly, movements deliberate and unhurried. The others barely noticed, still caught up in their celebration of Alex's wit. He was telling another story now, something about his golf game, gesturing wildly with his wine glass. "Excuse me, friends," I said quietly, voice carrying just enough to reach every ear. "I need to make one important call." Alex's head snapped up, eyes bright with opportunity. "Probably the king needs to call his carriage." The table erupted again. Marianne actually snorted with laughter this time, covering her mouth in embarrassment. "Alex, you're killing us! I can't breathe!" "Don't keep your royal subjects waiting, Your Majesty," Jim added, waving his hand in mock dismissal. I nodded politely, as if their laughter was applause I'd earned rather than mockery I'd endured. "I'll just be a moment." Emma watched me with worried eyes as I moved toward the foyer, but she said nothing. She couldn't, not without making the scene worse, and she knew it. Her silence was its own kind of prison. The dining room's warmth faded as I stepped into the hallway's shadows. Behind me, Alex's voice carried clearly, telling another joke at my expense. Something about royal plumbers and golden toilets. The others howled their approval. I pulled my phone from the side table drawer, scrolling through contacts until I found the number I needed. Victor Sullivan. Vic. My old partner. The one person who remembered who Frank Miller used to be, before he became just another grandfather carving turkey on holidays. The phone rang twice before his gravelly voice answered. "Frank, that you?" "Hello, Vic." I kept my voice low, barely above a whisper. "I need a favor?" After 20 years of retirement, this must be good. I could hear the interest in his tone, the old predator stirring to life. "What's the situation?" From the dining room came another burst of laughter. Alex was really hitting his stride now, probably encouraged by my absence. Let him enjoy it. Let them all enjoy it. "My son-in-law," I said simply. "He needs to learn some manners." "The gambling boy? The one with debts to Carmine's people?" "That's the one." Vic was quiet for a moment, processing. He had always been quick to understand implications, to read between lines. "How bad do you want this lesson to stick?" "Permanently," I replied, "but nothing that traces back to family dinner. Consider it handled." "When?" I glanced toward the dining room, where Alex's voice rose above the others, drunk on wine and validation. "Soon. Very soon. I'll make some calls. The usual understanding about payment. Money's no object. Good to have you back, Frank, even temporarily." I ended the call and slipped the phone back into the drawer. For a moment, I stood in the hallway's quiet shadows, listening to the sounds of continued celebration. They thought they'd witnessed a comedy tonight. They had no idea they'd actually attended the opening act of something much darker. When I returned to the dining room, Alex was mid-gesture, telling yet another story. He glanced up as I approached, that same smirk playing across his flushed features. "Back so soon, Your Highness? Did your royal advisor have urgent news from the kingdom?" More laughter, more applause, more rope for him to hang himself with. I took my seat calmly, picked up my fork, and resumed eating. "Just some old business," I said quietly. "Nothing that can't wait." But that wasn't true. The waiting was over. 25 minutes passed in relative quiet. Alex had settled into a satisfied glow, occasionally making small jokes that earned chuckles from our guests. I sat motionless, fork moving mechanically from plate to mouth, checking my watch with subtle glances. 4:09, 4:10. The doorbell rang. My smile was barely perceptible, just the slightest curve at the corner of my mouth. Perfect timing. Vic had always been reliable. "Oh, the old king called a taxi?" Alex's voice carried that familiar mocking tone, though with less energy than before. The wine was making him lazy, confident. "Alex," I said calmly, setting down my fork, "please open the door." He looked momentarily surprised at my direct request, then brightened. Another opportunity for performance. "Of course, Your Majesty." He pushed back from the table with exaggerated flourish, stumbling slightly as wine and gravity fought for control. Mary Ann giggled. "Such a gentleman, opening doors for mysterious visitors." "Probably a delivery driver," Susan added. "Everyone's working on Thanksgiving these days." Alex straightened his shirt and walked toward the foyer with the swagger of a man who owned the world. Each step carried him further from safety, though he couldn't know that. To him, this was simply another chance to demonstrate his superiority over the old man at the table. Emma's eyes followed her husband's movement, then snapped back to me. Something in my stillness was making her nervous. She could sense the change in atmospheric pressure that precedes a storm, even if she couldn't identify its source. "Frank," she said quietly, leaning toward me, "who would be visiting on Thanksgiving?" "Old friend," I replied without looking at her. My attention was fixed on the foyer, where Alex's confident footsteps echoed against hardwood floors. The other guests continued their casual conversation, paying little attention to the interruption. Jim was telling Paul about his new golf clubs. Mary Ann was asking Susan for her sweet potato recipe. Normal Thanksgiving dinner chatter. The kind that makes families feel connected and safe. I could hear Alex's hand on the doorknob, the metallic click as he turned the lock. In a few seconds, his entire world would change. 20 years of careful retirement, 20 years of letting people forget who Frank Miller used to be, was about to end. The door opened, Alex's voice still carrying traces of his earlier confidence. "Hello? Can I help you?" Then silence. Absolute, telling silence. Even from the dining room, I could feel the shift in energy. The pause stretched too long, became uncomfortable. Jim stopped mid-sentence about his golf clubs. Mary Ann's fork hovered halfway to her mouth. "Is everything all right out there?" Susan called toward the foyer. No response from Alex, but I knew exactly what was happening. Vic was introducing himself. Professional, calm, making it clear that this wasn't a social call. Alex was probably staring at three men who looked like they'd stepped out of his worst nightmares. The kind of men who collected debts from people who couldn't pay. "Maybe we should check on him," Emma whispered, starting to rise from her chair. "Sit," I said quietly, but with enough authority that she froze mid-motion. "He'll be back." My watch read 4:12, right on schedule. Through the dining room archway, I could see Alex's back silhouetted against the front door's glass panels. His posture had changed completely. Shoulders tense, head tilted forward, like he was straining to understand something impossible. "Good afternoon, Alex." Vic's voice carried clearly, calm and professional. "I'm Victor. We need to talk." Alex's response came as a strangled whisper. I don't understand. Who are you?" "A friend of your father-in-law. Step outside for a minute." The words hit Alex like physical blows. His hand, still gripping the doorframe, began to tremble visibly. He shot a quick glance back toward the dining room, his face pale as fresh snow. Emma half rose from her chair again. "Alex, what's going on?" "Everything's fine, sweetheart." Alex's voice cracked on the last word. Just some business. Be right back." But his body language told a different story. He moved like a man walking to his execution, stepping reluctantly across the threshold and disappearing from view. The front door remained open, letting cold November air drift into the house. Strange, Jim murmured, reaching for his wine glass. Who visits on Thanksgiving? Marianne wrapped her sweater tighter around her shoulders. Should we close the door? It's getting chilly in here. Leave it, I said simply. Emma's eyes locked onto mine, searching for answers I wasn't ready to give. She knew something was terribly wrong, but the pieces weren't connecting yet. Her husband had just walked outside with strangers who knew her father, and that father was sitting here with unnatural calm. Frank, she whispered urgently. What's happening? Who are those men? Old associates, I replied, cutting another piece of turkey with surgical precision. Nothing for you to worry about. But worry was exactly what she should be feeling. Outside, Alex was learning about consequences, about debts that needed paying, about the kind of people who didn't accept excuses or promises of future payment. Vic would be explaining things clearly, professionally, making sure Alex understood his situation completely. The conversation beyond the door was too quiet to overhear, but I could imagine every word. Vic had a gift for making people understand their circumstances without raising his voice. Bobby and Tony wouldn't even need to speak. Their presence alone would communicate everything necessary about the seriousness of the situation. How long has Alex been gambling? Susan asked quietly, as if the question had been bothering her all evening. The table fell silent. It was the kind of question everyone had been thinking, but nobody wanted to voice. Emma's face flushed red, confirming what we all suspected. He doesn't gamble, Emma said automatically, but her voice lacked conviction. Come on, Emma, Paul said gently. We've all seen the signs, the mood swings, the money stress, the way he talks about sure things and lucky breaks. She looked around the table desperately, realizing her husband's secrets weren't as well hidden as she'd hoped. It's not serious, just small games with friends. I continued eating, letting the conversation flow around me, let them piece together what they could. Soon the full picture would be impossible to ignore. The front door closed with a soft click that seemed to echo through the house like a gunshot. Alex's footsteps on the hardwood floor were different now, hesitant, unsteady, like a man walking on shifting ground. He appeared in the dining room archway looking like he'd aged 10 years in 3 minutes. His face was the color of old bone, sweat beading on his forehead, despite the November chill. His hands shook so violently he gripped the doorframe to steady himself. Alex? Emma started to rise, but froze when she saw his expression. The other guests turned to stare at this transformed version of the confident man who'd left to answer the door. Gone was the wine-flushed arrogance, the theatrical swagger. In its place stood someone who'd just glimpsed the edge of an abyss. Alex's eyes found mine across the room. In them, I saw complete understanding. Vic had been thorough, explaining not just the debt situation, but exactly who had the power to make his problems disappear, or get infinitely worse. Frank, he whispered, his voice barely audible. I looked up from my plate with mild curiosity, as if noticing him for the first time since he'd left the table. Yes, Alex? He took 3 unsteady steps into the room, then his legs gave out. He dropped to his knees beside my chair, with a sound like breaking branches, his hands reaching out in supplication. Father, Alex croaked, the word torn from his throat like a confession. Forgive me. I didn't mean it. It was a joke, I swear. Stop them. The dining room erupted in shocked gasps and confused murmurs. Marianne's wine glass slipped from her fingers, shattering against her plate. Jim pushed back from the table so quickly his chair toppled over. Alex! Emma scrambled around the table toward her husband. What happened? What's wrong? But Alex only had eyes for me. He knelt there, a broken man begging for mercy from the grandfather he'd mocked just hours earlier. Tears streamed down his cheeks, mixing with the sweat of pure terror. Please, he whispered. I'll do anything. I'll apologize to everyone. I'll never disrespect you again. Just, please call them off. I set down my fork carefully and looked down at him from my chair. The height difference was symbolic now, king and subject, power and powerlessness. The others watched in stunned silence, trying to process this complete reversal of evening's earlier dynamic. Call who off, Alex? I asked quietly. You know who? His voice broke completely. Victor, those men. They said you could make this all go away, or make it so much worse. Emma reached her husband's side and knelt beside him, her own face pale with dawning horror. Frank, what is this? What men? What's Alex talking about? I remained seated, looking down at the wreckage of my son-in-law's pride. Outside, Vic's car was probably already pulling away from the curb. Mission accomplished. The lesson had been delivered with surgical precision. I think, I said slowly, Alex has something he wants to discuss with all of us. The silence stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. I looked down at Alex, still trembling on his knees beside my chair, then slowly surveyed the shocked faces around my table. Time for truth. Alex, I said, my voice carrying the authority of decades spent commanding respect. Did you think you could humiliate me in front of my family? You forgot who I am. His sob caught in his throat. I didn't know. You didn't want to know. I reached for my wine glass, movements deliberate and controlled. You preferred your little fantasy where I was just a harmless old man you could mock for entertainment. Emma's face had gone pale as winter sky. She knew exactly where this was heading, remembering stories I'd told her years ago about the life I'd left behind. Dad, please. I knew about your debts, Alex. The words dropped into the room like stones into still water. Big debts and not bank debts. Mary Ann's hand flew to her mouth. Susan gripped Paul's arm so tightly her knuckles went white. Jim sat frozen, his overturned chair still lying on the floor behind him. Alex's head snapped up, eyes wide with fresh terror. How could you possibly? Because I make it my business to know about threats to my family. I took a measured sip of wine, letting the weight of that statement settle. Did you think your gambling was a secret? Your midnight phone calls? The way you flinch every time an unknown number appears on your screen? Frank, Emma whispered, reaching for my arm. Stop this, please. But I couldn't stop. Not now. 20 years of peaceful retirement had ended the moment Alex decided to turn me into his personal joke. He knew what he was getting into when he took money from those people, Emma. He made his choices. I'll fix it, Alex's voice cracked with desperation. I'll find the money somehow. I just need more time. I looked down at him with something approaching pity. Time? Alex, you've had months to fix this. Instead, you doubled down, borrowed more, made bigger bets with money you didn't have. The guests sat transfixed, watching this family drama unfold like spectators at a car accident. They'd come for turkey and harmless dinner conversation. Instead, they were witnessing the unraveling of everything they thought they knew about the Miller family. I've been watching your schemes for a long time, I continued, my voice never rising above conversational level. The fake business opportunities you pitched to Emma's friends, the sob stories about temporary cash flow problems. But tonight crossed the line. Alex tried to speak, but only a strangled sound emerged. Emma's tears had started flowing, understanding finally dawning that her father wasn't just threatening, he was demonstrating power he'd never truly abandoned. You see, I said, addressing the entire table now, respect isn't something you can take back once you've thrown it away. Alex forgot that lesson tonight. Outside, a car engine started and pulled away from the curb. Vic, leaving as quietly as he'd arrived, his work done. Alex heard it too, and shuddered like a man feeling his own grave being dug. Now, I said, setting down my wine glass with finality, we're going to discuss what happens next. I turned my attention to Emma, my voice softening slightly. The hardest part of any lesson is explaining it to the people you love most. Daughter, family is sacred, but your husband chose this path himself. Emma's tears fell freely now, her loyalty torn between the father who'd raised her and the man she'd married. Dad, he's made mistakes, but he's still my husband. He's still family. Is he? I asked quietly. Because family protects each other. Family doesn't use each other for entertainment. Alex tried to raise his head from where he knelt, voice barely a whisper. I'll fix it. I'll find the money. Give me a little more time. Time won't solve your character problem, Alex. I kept my eyes on Emma as I spoke. Your husband owes $60,000 to people who don't accept payment plans, but that's not why we're here. Susan made a small gasping sound. $60,000 was more than most of these people made in a year. The number hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Frank, Emma pleaded, gripping my arm with both hands. Whatever you're planning, don't do it. Not on Thanksgiving, not in front of everyone. I covered her hands with mine, feeling how cold they'd become. I'm not planning anything, sweetheart. I already did it. Her face crumpled with understanding. The phone call. He knew what he was getting into when he took money from those people, I repeated, each word carefully chosen. He knew the risks. He chose to take them anyway. Alex's breathing had become shallow, panicked. Emma, tell him I'll change. I won't gamble anymore. I'll get help. I'll do whatever it takes. But I'd heard these promises before, whispered into phones during his midnight conversations with creditors. Empty words from a man who'd already proven he couldn't keep them. Your husband has been living a double life, I told Emma gently. Secret debts, failed schemes, lies upon lies. And tonight, he decided to make me part of his comedy routine. Mary Ann and Jim exchanged horrified glances. This wasn't the family dinner they'd expected. This was something darker, more real than their comfortable suburban lives had prepared them for. I've been watching him for months, I continued, waiting to see if he'd find his way back to being the man you married. Instead, he got worse, bolder, more reckless. Emma's sobs shook her entire body. But killing him won't solve anything. Who said anything about killing? I asked, genuinely puzzled by her assumption. The relief that flooded Alex's face was almost comical. He'd been imagining the worst possible scenario, and my question had just opened a door to hope he hadn't dared consider. There are many ways to teach respect, I said, rising slowly from my chair for the first time since the crisis began. Death is the least creative option. I walked toward the front door, leaving them all frozen in the dining room, suspended between fear and hope. Time to negotiate terms that would satisfy everyone's needs. Alex's survival, my reputation, and Emma's peace of mind. The front door opened before I could reach for the handle. Vic stood on the porch, Bobby and Tony flanking him like professional shadows. 3 decades of partnership meant we could communicate with glances what others needed lengthy conversations to achieve. How long does he need? Vic asked without preamble. A week, I said simply. This is a lesson, not punishment. Vic nodded slowly, understanding the distinction. Carmine's people won't wait forever. They will if you ask them to. I stepped onto the porch, closing the door behind me to ensure our conversation remained private. Tell them Frank Miller is personally guaranteeing this debt gets resolved within 7 days. And if it doesn't, then Alex learns a harder lesson. I glanced back toward the house, where my family waited in terrified suspension. But Emma doesn't need to watch. Bobby shifted slightly, the first movement I'd seen from him all evening. Even silent muscle understood the implications of invoking my name in certain circles. Debts could be forgiven, postponed, or transferred, but respect was non-negotiable. 7 days, Vic confirmed. Starting tonight. Starting now, I corrected. He's had months to figure this out on his own. Now he gets 1 week with proper motivation. Through the window, I could see Alex still on his knees in the dining room, Emma hovering beside him, the guests frozen like deer, sensing wolves. Thanksgiving dinner had become something none of them would ever forget. Vic extended his hand, and I shook it firmly. Good to see you back in action, Frank, even temporarily. Temporarily, I agreed. This is about family, not business. They walked back to their car with unhurried professionalism, engines starting quietly and pulling away into the November evening. Normal suburban sounds returned, distant traffic, someone's dog barking, the hum of heating units preparing for winter's arrival. I stepped back inside, closing the door with deliberate finality. The click echoed through the house like a judge's gavel, announcing the verdict. In the dining room, 7 pairs of eyes tracked my movement as I returned to my seat. Alex looked up from his kneeling position with desperate hope battling continued terror on his features. You've been given a break, I announced to the room, settling back into my chair with the same calm authority I'd maintained throughout the evening. 1 week. Alex's sob of relief was audible throughout the house. Thank you. Thank you. I'll fix everything, I promise. Promises are what got you into this situation, I reminded him. Results are what will get you out. Emma reached for her husband, helping him to his feet on shaking legs. He swayed momentarily, still overwhelmed by the rapid swing from certain doom to unexpected reprieve. 7 days, I repeated, making sure everyone understood the terms. After that, this becomes someone else's problem to solve. The message was clear to everyone, except perhaps the guests, who were still processing the revelation that their host wasn't the harmless retiree they'd thought they knew. Alex nodded frantically, wiping tears and sweat from his face. I understand. 7 days. I'll find a way. I picked up my fork and returned to my turkey. Good. Now, shall we finish our Thanksgiving dinner? Nobody moved for 30 seconds that felt like hours. The suggestion of continuing dinner hung in the air like smoke from a fire nobody wanted to acknowledge. Mary Ann was the first to break the spell, reaching for her purse with movements so careful they seemed choreographed. "Actually, Frank," she said, voice pitched higher than normal, "I think we should probably head home. It's getting late and Jim has work tomorrow." Jim nodded eagerly, already pushing back from the table. "Early meeting, you know how it is?" The exodus began with polite murmurs and nervous smiles. Susan gathered her sweater, while Paul stood too quickly, knocking his napkin to the floor. Nobody bent to retrieve it. The normal rhythms of departure had been replaced by something more urgent, though everyone pretended otherwise. "I hope everything will be all right," Mary Ann whispered to Emma as they moved toward the foyer, her words barely audible but heavy with unspoken questions. Emma managed a weak smile, playing the hostess role despite her own shock. Of course, just family business, you know. But none of them knew, and that was exactly the problem. They had witnessed something that shifted their understanding of reality, seen the mild-mannered grandfather transform into someone with power they couldn't comprehend or categorize. Alex stood on unsteady legs, his jacket draped over his arm like a flag of surrender. His hands trembled as he attempted to put it on, the simple task suddenly complex in his current state. I'll go home," he said, addressing me directly. "Thank you for the opportunity." I looked up from my plate, fork halfway to my mouth. 1 week, Alex. The reminder hit him like a physical blow, shoulders sagging under the weight of his deadline. He nodded once, then followed the others toward the door, with the gait of a man walking underwater. Emma moved between foyer and dining room, torn between hosting duties and the need to stay close to me. She helped with coats and offered parting pleasantries, but her attention kept drifting back to where I sat, calmly finishing my meal as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. "Thank you for having us," Susan said, though her voice carried the tone of someone grateful to be leaving rather than for having attended. "Drive safely," Emma replied automatically. Car doors slammed in the driveway. Engine started with unusual haste. Within 5 minutes, the house that had been full of laughter and conversation stood nearly empty, containing only the lingering scent of turkey and the weight of unfinished business. Alex was the last to leave, hovering in the doorway like a man afraid to step outside, but equally afraid to stay. "The cars," he said suddenly. "I'll start with the cars." "Good thinking," I replied, not looking up from my plate. Emma closed the door behind him and leaned against it, finally allowing her composure to crack. "What just happened here, Dad?" I set down my fork and looked at my daughter, really looked at her. She deserved honesty, but not the kind that would keep her awake for the next month. "Your husband learned some manners," I said simply, "and our guests learned that family dinners can be educational." The Manhattan Cafe bustled with afternoon energy. Business professionals hunched over laptops between gleaming skyscrapers. I chose a corner table with my back to the wall, old habits from a different life, and watched the entrance while sipping black coffee. Alex arrived exactly on time. That alone told me something had changed. The man who'd spent months dodging creditor calls and making excuses had learned punctuality in 7 days. He looked thinner, tired, but carried himself differently. Gone was the swagger that had masked his desperation. "Frank," he said, approaching the table with careful steps, "thank you for agreeing to meet." I gestured to the empty chair across from me. "You said it was important." He sat down, placing a manila folder on the table between us. "I wanted to personally thank you and to show you what I accomplished this week." Opening the folder, he spread out documents like an accountant presenting financial statements, car titles, bank transfer receipts, a jeweler's appraisal for his Rolex, stock liquidation papers. "Had to sell the cars, the Rolex watch, some stocks I'd been holding," he explained, voice steady despite the magnitude of what he'd sacrificed. "Wasn't easy, but I managed to cover everything." I examined the papers without comment, noting the thoroughness of his documentation. 2 vehicles sold below market value for quick cash. The watch, a graduation gift from Emma, gone for less than half its retail price. Investments liquidated with early withdrawal penalties. "The debts?" I asked. "Paid in full." He pulled out final payment confirmations, each stamped and signed by very serious people who didn't typically provide such formal documentation. Carmine's people were professional about it. They mentioned your name. The weight of those words settled between us. My reputation had preceded me into rooms I hadn't entered in 20 years, carrying enough authority to transform Alex's death sentence into a manageable transaction. You saved me from much bigger problems, Alex continued, his voice dropping to near whisper despite the ambient cafe noise. I know what would have happened if you hadn't intervened. The important thing is, you learned the lesson, I replied, sliding the documents back across the table. Respect isn't just about words, Alex. It's about choices. He nodded, hands shaking slightly as he gathered the papers. I understand that now. The hard way, but I understand. Steam rose from my coffee cup as I studied the man across from me. 7 days ago, he'd been a gambling addict with borrowed time and borrowed money. Today he sat before me as someone who'd faced consequences and survived them. Emma doesn't know the details, he said, reading my thoughts, about the amounts or the people involved. She knows we talked, that things are settled. Good. I leaned back in my chair, watching office workers hurry past the floor-to-ceiling windows. Some burdens are better carried by one person. Alex folded his hands on the table, the manila folder closed beside his coffee cup. Outside, Manhattan moved at its relentless pace, but inside our corner booth, time felt suspended between confession and absolution. I promise, no more gambling, no debts, he said, each word deliberate and measured. I know how close I came to losing everything, not just money, Emma, the family, everything that actually matters. I studied his face, looking for traces of the arrogant man who'd mocked me 7 days earlier. That person seemed to have been stripped away along with his material possessions, leaving someone more honest, if diminished. Good, I said simply. Family above everything, Alex? Family above everything, he repeated, like a man taking an oath. Emma shouldn't know the details about what happened this week, the sales, the people I dealt with. She'll be happy we reconciled, and that's enough. The wisdom in that statement surprised me. Alex had learned more than just the value of respect. He'd learned the art of protection through selective truth. Some lessons couldn't be taught through lectures or threats. They had to be lived. She'll be happy, I agreed. Emma always worried about the tension between us. She loves us both, which put her in an impossible position. Alex's smile was rueful, but genuine. I made it impossible. I thought I could treat you like just another obstacle to navigate around. I forgot that you're her father first, and that means something. Through the window, I watched a father and young daughter walking hand in hand down the sidewalk, heading towards Central Park. The girl pointed excitedly at something beyond my view, while her father smiled down at her. Simple moments that carried more weight than any business transaction. The gambling wasn't just about money, Alex continued unprompted. It was about feeling in control of something. But control is an illusion when you're playing other people's games with other people's rules. I nodded, understanding more than he realized. Real control comes from knowing your limits and respecting them. Exactly. He extended his hand across the table. I'd like to start over, if you're willing, not as the son-in-law who caused problems, but as family. I looked at his outstretched hand for a moment, then reached across to shake it firmly. His grip was steady now, no tremor of fear or desperation. Just a man keeping his word. Family, I agreed. Standing to leave, Alex gathered his folder and pulled on his jacket. Not the expensive coat he'd worn to Thanksgiving, but something simpler, more practical. Everything about him had been pared down to essentials. Thank you, Frank, for everything. Even the hard parts. I remained seated as he walked away, watching through the window as he emerged onto the busy sidewalk and disappeared into the crowd. Just another businessman in a city full of them, carrying his lessons instead of his debts. My phone buzzed with a text from Emma. Dad, Alex said you two talked and worked things out. Thank you for giving him another chance, I typed back. He earned it. The Manhattan skyline stretched beyond the window, steel and glass reaching toward winter clouds. Somewhere in that maze of ambition and consequence, my son-in-law was learning to build a different kind of life. The lesson had cost him everything he thought he wanted, but taught him what he actually needed. Family above everything. Even when family required hard choices. If you liked this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.